My name is James Green. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative at Brown University and a professor of Brazilian history and culture in the history department and the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies. This is an event that is kind of co-sponsored by the Brazil Initiative and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies Brazil Study Group, which we've had this last year, and decided this semester to have a final public event which would talk about the state of democracy in Brazil. And we have a very eclectic panel this evening. I'm very excited about the people who will be participating. Sidney Chalhoub from Harvard University, who's a professor of history and African American and Afro-Latin American studies, will be basically moderating the panel or fielding the questions at the end. Sidney Chalhoub is a fabulous acquisition for Harvard and for Brown University because he's a real ally. We've already been starting to work in collaborations together. We were able to support an excellent conference that he organized on Afro-Brazilians at Harvard this last week, and we're looking forward to many future collaborations. And so as we were putting together the panel tonight, we really wanted to invite him to be with us as a symbol of the kind of ways that we would like to work more closely with Harvard in the future. Our panelists, and they'll be speaking in this order, and then Sidney will speak last and tie up things, is Iman Musa Jadala, who is from Brasilia and is a Brown undergraduate student. She is kind of one of the best. Every year some wonderful student walks into my office, and she walked into my office this year, and I'm so glad she did. She is going to be coordinating the Opening the Archives project in Washington, D.C., in which we're digitizing U.S. government documents on Brazil during the period of the military regime. And she'll be coordinating a group of 9 Brown undergraduates in this project. So we're really happy that she's able to do that. And she'll be speaking first, followed by Andre Pagliariani, recently doctored. He just received his doctorate last week or the week before last, and he will be graduating in history. Andre is a Brazilian American, born of Brazilian parents, but born in the United States, but very connected to Brazil, so he really lives a globalized binational world. And Jiri Augusto, who is a professor of Africana Studies and in the Watson Institute is an associate professor of international and public affairs. A person with an amazing biography that took her from a family of civil rights activists in the South involved in the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other activities in the 60s, to Africa, to Angola, to South Africa, to other parts of Africa, and then eventually to Bahia and to Brown. And we're really lucky that she is with us at Brown. And she's currently working in a very important collaborative project with scholars and activists in Bahia, mostly Afro-descendant, and bringing a connection between institutions in Brazil and the United States. We've asked people to speak about 10 to 15 minutes approximately, so we'll have time for a discussion and questions and answers afterward. And then after that, we're having a reception. And I'm seeing Ramon concerned about what I just said, because some people are maybe thinking about 20 minutes, and that's fine. I know that some people will be speaking 10 minutes because that's what they've planned, and other people will be speaking more. That'll be fine. And these are important scholars who understand the dynamic of audience feelings about how they're doing. So I'm sure they'll moderate their talks appropriately. But it's 15 to 20 minutes is what I actually originally said. I apologize for making that mistake. Before I end my opening remarks, I have to thank, as always, Ramon Stern, who is the program administrator of the Brazil Initiative, who has done an amazing job in organizing all of the events this year. He deserves a round of applause. I want to remind people we're having our final film of the Brazilian film series tomorrow. That and this event are the last events of the semester, but we're already planning an amazing fall with the Cine Brasil Film Festival in the early fall, with a series of very exciting activities throughout the year, and we hope to see all of you at our events this next year. Thank you all for coming. And so with that, I'll let Iman begin.
Should we speak from there?
Probably better from the podium.
Yes, because we're filming.
Okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm very happy and honored to be speaking here at this event tonight. But I think that before I start, I should let you all know that I'm not a scholar or a specialist in Brazilian politics, so I will be mainly speaking from a personal perspective, which is based on my years growing up in Brazil and on what I still follow about what is happening in the country right now. But I also know that my personal interpretation of what is happening right now in Brazil is also something shared by other groups in Brazilian society. So I hope that by sharing my view here today with you, you can all get a holistic and comprehensive understanding of what is going on in Brazil. I guess that a good way to introduce the theme of my talk is by sharing why I was invited to be speaking here in the first place. So about a month and a half ago, when it was becoming very evident that President Lula would be arrested, I asked Professor Green if we could create an international petition to gather support from American academics to denounce his illegal imprisonment and the general political persecution that he had been suffering over the last months. And in fact, there is already a manifest circulating around the world demanding Lula's release and the end of lawfare in Brazil. Subscribers of this manifest include intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, Angela Davis, and Peter Evans. So it is clear to me that, and many other people actually, that Lula's imprisonment is unjust, illegal, and above all, an attack to Brazilian democracy. It is no coincidence that Lula's conviction happened just before the 2018 election. His case was intentionally put ahead of almost 300 other cases that were pending judgment in order for him to be judged before this year's election. And that happened because as soon as the elites and the media realized that Lula could be a candidate in this year's election, and that he actually had very high chances of winning, a movement started being articulated with the judiciary to keep him out of the presidential run. And the way to achieve this goal was simple. It was to create in the public imaginary the idea that Lula was the most corrupt politician in the history of Brazil. By doing that, they would gather the public support necessary to make his illegal imprisonment possible and justifiable. So his prosecutors went as far as to claim that Lula was the head of the criminal organization that assaulted our state-run oil company, Petrobras, even though no single evidence to prove that was presented. And even though Lula was regarded as the head of this scheme that stole millions of dollars from Petrobras, the one wrongdoing he has been condemned for was receiving a modest apartment as bribe from a Brazilian construction company called OAS. And I'm not saying that because it was just an apartment that he shouldn't be condemned, because what is very problematic here is that there isn't a single proof showing that the apartment belongs to Lula. Had there been a clear and unquestionable proof that the apartment is his, we would not be talking about political persecution. We would instead be talking simply about law enforcement. But unfortunately, that is not the case. When we see the politicization of the judiciary taking place, we can no longer talk about justice and impartiality. In fact, the morality and impartiality of our judiciary system, which is an institution meant to safeguard democracy, is simply being discarded in the way they are dealing with Lula's case. Many jurists from all around the world have pointed out the fragility of the accusations made against Lula. And this criticism doesn't come from a political bias, because what they question is the legal aspects of the accusation and essentially the absence of proofs to condemn Lula. And I guess that only reinforces my personal belief that this whole process is nothing but political persecution. Sending Lula to jail without evidence or presumption of innocence demonstrates the very unhealthy functioning of the Brazilian justice system. So there is a great disconnect between this idea that Lula was the mind behind all the corruption that was happening in the country and the fact that even though he had the power to steal as much money as he wished from the company, he decided to only accept a beach apartment as bribe, an apartment which again has never been proved to be his. I guess that we could spend hours talking about the many questionable and improper things that happened throughout Lula's trial and why the totality of these facts makes him today a political prisoner. But I believe that it is way more interesting and constructive to explore the reasons why Lula came to be so persecuted and hated by parts of the society, while also being loved and praised by other groups. As I speak, for example, a number of people are gathered in front of the prison where Lula is being kept in order to express their solidarity to the ex-president. And just a few days ago, the Solidarity Camp was attacked with bullets by anti-Lula individuals in another episode of political violence against democracy. So there is a clear divide in Brazilian society. And the fact that this divide exists and the way it is given is, in my opinion, a mere reflection of the class dynamics we inherited from our slavery past. Although it has been years since slavery was abolished in Brazil and the subjugation of parts of the population by the elite was made unconstitutional, sections of our current elite and middle class still fantasize about those days when they had certain control over the poor people and their privileges were not questioned by anyone. When the middle class took the streets to call for Dilma's impeachment and Lula's arrest, they were not denouncing the epidemic corruption that we see in the country. The middle class only took the streets because they cultivate a selective hatred towards Lula and the Workers' Party. If they were truly against corruption, we would still see them in the streets because there is no evidence that corruption has decreased in Brazil ever since Michel Temer took over. In fact, our own president is being investigated for corruption right now, but I highly doubt that we're going to see the middle class organizing massive protests calling for his imprisonment like they did for Lula. And the reason for that is very clear. The middle class is scared of what Lula and his Workers' Party represent. Lula was born in a very poor family in the northeast of Brazil. He did not go to college, but rather started working since he was a child to help sustaining his family. And the very own fact that his background is not consistent with the background of those who usually occupy leadership positions in Brazil is on its own something that causes certain discomfort among the middle class. We cannot forget that there is a divide between the south and the northeast of Brazil, in which people from the south see those from the northeast as backward and uneducated. But Lula would not be targeted with so much hatred had his only mistake been to have a humble and poor background. The big problem for some people is that Lula was the one president who dared to change a little bit the social structure in order in Brazil. About 15 years ago, it was fairly common to turn on the TV and see images of people starving to death, especially in the Northeast. But by the time Lula finished his period in office, those images were definitely not as frequent anymore. And that is not just a personal impression I got growing up and watching Brazilian news. It is a fact, because indexes show that by 2014, 29 million people who used to live in extreme poverty were not starving anymore, and for the first time in 2014, Brazil did not appear in the United Nations hunger map. And the reason why this was possible was in big part due to the social programs implemented by Lula. Social programs which are suffering severe cuts by the current government, making the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN declare that there is a risk that Brazil will appear in the hunger map again. Through his social policies, Lula allowed the poor to have access to a more humane and decent life, not only by giving them the means to survive, but also by democratizing the access to college education. During his time in office, the number of students registered in college has doubled, and the number of low-income students attending college had never been as high. And I personally think that this is the aspect of Lula's administration that the middle class resent the most, because the control over knowledge by the elite has always been an important weapon in making the subjugation of the poor in Brazil possible. For some members of the middle class, it is still unacceptable to believe that a poor person can take up public spaces now. Our middle class was used to having exclusive access to universities and other public spaces, but now they have to compete with another significant part of the population to access those spaces that once were taken for granted by them. So I guess it is important to notice this egoistic aspect of why parts of the middle class is so much against some of Lula's social reforms. If the social reforms had been carried out without harming the middle class privileges, I guess we would not see that so much reaction from them. But we know that it is impossible to make real changes without structural reforms that will obviously end up shaking the status quo and affecting some groups' privileges. And we must acknowledge, especially the left, I guess, that Lula has failed to make some of these structural reforms. Although Lula lifted millions of Brazilians out of poverty, it is also true that the Brazilian elite only got richer during his administration, and the income inequality in Brazil remained being a big problem. It is unacceptable to have 56% of the country's wealth concentrated in the hands of 10% of the population. Had Lula been this revolutionary man who intended to turn Brazil into a socialist country, as many like to believe, we would not see these absurd numbers in relation to income inequality. I guess that Lula was actually a conciliator. He did not confront our elites by taxing the rich people more, as he should have done, but instead allowed banks and the agribusiness to profit during his administration. But Lula also made the poor to have access to a more decent life by alleviating poverty in Brazil and facilitating their access to education. That is all he did. And the fact that our elite hates Lula so much for having given just the minimum to the poor while they were still profiting is something that really, really concerns me. So the middle class feared that Lula could come back to power in 2018 with an agenda that would not benefit only them. And hence the whole persecution against him started. And I guess we must admit, it was successful. Lula is now in jail and will most likely not run in the presidential run in October, even though the opinion polls indicate that he could win. Democracy is being explicitly attacked in Brazil ever since President Dilma was impeached. The opposition took out of power a president that was democratically elected by the people, and now by arresting Lula, they are again trying to tell people who is right to govern the country, completely disregarding the people's choice. And if we think that one of the main aspects of a functioning democracy is the people's right to elect their governors, Brazil's democracy is being severely attacked right now. And I guess I'll stop here. Thank you.
Oh, it's already. Oh, thank you, Ramon. All right, thank you. So I decided for the first time to actually do a PowerPoint with my presentation, so hopefully it goes well, but oh well. Okay. So I want to thank you all for coming. This is a nice sort of capstone to my time at Brown to be a part of this event, so I'm grateful to be invited. And thank you all for being here on such a beautiful day. So before I start, I want to say that my talk is very sort of impressionistic. My main goal is to put some ideas on the table so that we can have a lot of things to talk about afterwards. And in that regard, I'm glad Iman went first, because a lot of what she said will, I think, help give a little more sort of context and substance to what I'm about to say. On April 7th, former President Lula gave a speech outside the headquarters of the Metal Workers Union that propelled him to national prominence some 40 years ago. Charged with corruption and sentenced to over a decade behind bars, he promised to turn himself over to authorities that evening, but not before giving one last fiery speech for his supporters, his opponents, and presumably also for posterity. If the anti-Lula forces dreamed of humiliating him with images of the former president being hauled away sort of unceremoniously in handcuffs, they were sorely disappointed. Lula and his allies actually managed what I think all sides would consider a pretty perfect feat of political theater in depicting his arrest as politically motivated. Indeed, Lula left the demonstration as something close to a living martyr. Here's another image of that day. In his speech, Lula deliberately argued that his connection with the Brazilian masses transcended politics, that he shared their dreams and frustrations. There is no point in trying to end my ideas, he said. They are already lingering in the air, and you can't arrest them. There is no point in trying to stop me from dreaming, because once I cease dreaming, I'll keep dreaming through your minds and your dreams. There is no point in thinking that everything will stop when I have a heart attack. That's nonsense, because, and this is a key passage, my heart shall beat through your hearts, and there are millions of hearts. There is no point in thinking they will make me stop. I will not stop because I'm not a human being, I'm an idea. an idea that is mixed with all of your ideas. I will obey this arrest warrant, but all of you are going to have to go through a transformation. Your names will no longer be Chiquinha, Joãozinho, Zezinho, Robertinho. All of you from now on will become Lula and will walk through this country doing what you must do every day. Every day. By dramatically invoking the masses in his defense at an almost metaphysical level, right, this idea of sort of an organic metaphysical connection, Lula personalized a long history of social and racial exclusion. In that moment, he was arguing, Lula was the impoverished and working masses, and the poor and working classes were Lula. This is the argument he's making. By impeaching his protege, Dilma Rousseff, in 2016, and now arresting him, Lula argued that the authorities were in fact targeting his supporters, the working men and women who had propelled his party to 13 years in power and likely would have sent him back to the presidency if he were allowed to run. Lula's speech is a pretty fascinating historical document in its own right, but I think it becomes even more intriguing when we consider the historical parallels that he's clearly intending to strike. Most obviously, the national leader Lula was trying to evoke was Getúlio Vargas, the man who originally seized power in 1930, oversaw a dictatorship from 1937 to 1945. Oops, that didn't work. And was then elected to the presidency in 1950 before committing suicide in 1954 as the political opposition moved to oust him from office. Lula, the metal worker who became a union leader, who then became the most popular president in Brazilian history, differs from Vargas, who was a former dictator and large landowner from the southern part of the country, in several important ways. There's a lot that sets these two men apart. Yet they arguably played similar roles in the political context of their time. Indeed, headlines blaring accusations of corruption against a political leader beloved by millions, conservative forces sensing weakness and disarray among their opponents, an austere economic outlook, and a rapidly changing political landscape, the final days of Getúlio Vargas' government in 1954 bear a lot of reverberate today in kind of surprising ways. With this sort of historical context in mind, it's worth remembering that the difficult scenario in Brazil today is distressing and unpredictable, but not completely historically unprecedented. Between the presidential election of 1930, which was held in March of that year, and the so-called revolution that took place in October of that year, there was tremendous uncertainty about the survival of the republic as it then existed. The same was true in the turbulent weeks and months that precipitated the installation of Vargas's dictatorship, the Estado Novo. The same was true the days before Vargas's dramatic suicide in 1954, this sense of chaos and uncertainty about what was to come. Also before his protege, João Goulart, fell victim to a coup 10 years after Vargas committed suicide, and also before the military dictatorship took a decisively authoritarian turn in December 1968. Again, this idea of uncertainty. So these were all periods of extreme volatility, to say nothing of the combustible nature of Brazilian politics since the return of democracy in 1985, with only 2 of 7 presidents completing terms to which they were elected. 2 of 7. So in 1954, amid widespread allegations of corruption that had been trumped up in the press, which was almost universally opposed to his government, Vargas shot himself in the heart. Suicide, in this instance, offered a way of avoiding an ignominious end to his many years at the center of national life. It also promised to turn the tide against his enemies, Vargas's enemies, weaponizing public sentiment against those who had driven him into this corner. The main way that Vargas achieved this was by leaving behind a very carefully crafted suicide note, with language that bears a striking resemblance to the language Lula used in his speech on April 7th. So here I kind of compare a little bit, and I'm just going to read a little bit from Vargas's letter. To hatred I respond with forgiveness, and to those who think they have defeated me, I reply with my victory. I was a slave of the people, and today I'm freeing myself for eternal life. But this people, whose slave I was, will no longer be slave to anyone. My sacrifice will remain forever in your souls, and my blood will be the price of your ransom. I fought against the looting of Brazil. I fought against the looting of the people. I have fought bare-breasted. The hatred, infamy, and calumny did not defeat my spirit. I have given you my life. I gave you my life. Now I offer you my death. Nothing remains. Serenely, I take my first step on the road to eternity, and I leave life to enter history. And Lula, this is the passage I cited earlier. I would just underscore that first part again. My heart shall beat through your hearts, and there are millions of hearts. Right, and this idea, there's no stopping me, because as long as you live, you the people, as long as you work hard, as long as you're out there resisting and struggling, I will live through you. There are even more echoes if one were to read the full documents, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. So what's fascinating about the case of Lula is that something similar to what happened after the death of Vargas seems to be taking place even as the legal drama has dragged on, and while the former president remains very much alive and indeed politically active. And then I can say more about this in the Q&A. I cut out some things making that comparison. In early March of this year, a video made the rounds on the internet, maybe some of you saw it, of a sympathizer of President Lula, identified only as Pedrinho in the video, looking earnestly right into the camera, explaining that if Lula had stolen anything, it was only so that he could redistribute national wealth more broadly to people like him. And it's worth playing a little bit of the video, and I'll translate a little bit afterwards.
Pedro, o que é que você acha? Se Lula for condenado à cadeia, você, à prisão, você vai tirar os dias dele na cadeia? Quanto dias? Se ele pegar 20 anos, você tira quantos?
Eu tiro 10 anos no lugar dele. A Polícia Federal, o que tiver promotor e tudo, pode vir tirar 10 anos de cadeia minha aqui em Serra Talhada, que eu sou de Serra Talhada, entendeu, compadre? O sofrimento na minha vida que eu vivo, que nós vivíamos trabalhando e nós estamos parados hoje por causa de porra, de política, de ladrão e tudo. Lula, tudo bem, você pegou as coisinhas dele, foi muito, pouca, mas pelo menos dividiu com nós. Por isso que eu quero dividir o roubo dele. Eu quero dividir o roubo. Se disser que ele roubou, divido o roubo. Eu vou...
Divide a cadeia, né?
Divido a cadeia com ele. Se ele roubou, foi para me dar. Se ele roubou, foi para me dar. Eu não. Há um bocado de nordestino. Tá entendendo, compadre? E cadê? Eu tiro. Se ele pegar 20 anos, eu tiro 10. Se pegar 40, eu tiro 20. Porque eu gostei demais do presidente. Ele pegou as coisinhas dele, isso é normal. É muito normal, viu, companheiro? Vocês citou que o Brasil da rede está corrupto de gente ladrão. Mas a maioria do ladrão rouba para ele e não quer dividir com o povo. Lula dividiu, meu. Hoje eu tenho minha casa, eu tenho meu carro novo para morar. E não foi roubando, não. Foi Lula que me deu emprego para eu trabalhar. E ganhei casa, carro. E até hoje estou comendo do dinheiro que ele me deu. Agora hoje me encontro desempregado e Michel Temer agora começou a comer a coisinha. Estou voltando tudinho.
E esse vídeo eu posso colocar na internet?
Pode colocar, quem está mandando aqui se chama Pedrinho. E se Lula aceitar esse aí, você fique repassando até Lula pegar esse vídeo e manda ele repassar para mim, que eu gosto de Lula demais. Lula é um pai, é o segundo pai meu que fez na minha vida. Foi Lula.
So, Pedrinho, by sort of his affect and his accent, he's clearly from the Northeast, like Lula himself. Basically what he's doing, he's offering to carry out half of Lula's sentence, whatever that is. Whatever, if it's 40 years, he'll do 20. If it's 20, he'll do 10. And the reason being that, okay, even if he stole something, it was just so that he could redistribute it to us, later on down the road. Whatever, he might have taken a taste of the sort of federal largesse illicitly, and that's wrong, but at the end of the day, he looked out for people like Pedrinho. Pedrinho's loyalty will never actually be put to the test, of course, but he doesn't seem to be joking, at least I don't see it that way. His outrage at Lula's perceived persecution is palpable, even, I think, moving. After Vargas fired a bullet into his heart on August 24th, 1954, outraged supporters took to the streets, defacing the headquarters of the conservative newspaper O Globo, among other targets. It was as if the weeks, months, and years of conservative attacks on the president had been directed at his most ardent supporters, who were now lashing out in the most visceral way. The irony of the Vargas-Lula connection, of course, is that Lula's rise was fueled in part by a fundamental critique of the corporatist labor structure that Vargas introduced in 1943, which was essentially a legal agreement that tethered workers to the state through state-sanctioned unions. Lula's party, the PT, signed on to this critical view, which largely prevailed among much of the left during the dictatorship from 64 to 85, which saw Vargas as a populist manipulator fundamentally disinterested in structural change. Rather, the argument was that Vargas had used people like Pedrinho for political expediency. Time has changed this harsh assessment, though, especially among the PT. Political scientist Emir Sader, for example, has stated outright that the PT was wrong about Vargas. He explained the shift in historical terms, noting that the forces that drove Getúlio to suicide, who struck against Goulart in 1964, and who opposed the Lula government, are the same right-wing forces that were hegemonic during the military dictatorship, and that instigated and promoted neoliberalism in Brazil. So he's drawing a direct correlation between basically progressive forces in Brazil today and the left with Vargas' legacy and the conservative lineage that opposes Lula today, directly going back to this sort of moralizing crusade against Vargas. In taking a broad view of Brazilian history, I find it's impossible not to see the opponents of Vargas and Lula as players on the same team in this long-running political game. The former dictator and the erstwhile metal worker, for their part, entered history as widely beloved progressive champions whose team has often been outscored but rarely outmatched. And I can say more about what I mean there. Considering the agenda, and here I'm concluding, considering the agenda embraced by the foes of Vargas and Lula, which we can talk about a little later, it should not shock us that only one side of this enduring dispute produces martyrs whose loss is mourned by millions. Thank you.
My images are not as good as the other ones were. Good evening, everyone. I'm obviously not in Brazil right now, though I was there about 6 weeks ago. But like many of you, I keep a constant dialogue with colleagues and friends, and I dare say family there. So I thought what might be useful for me to present tonight is some of what I've been hearing, some of what we've been discussing. By we, I mean me and my Brazilian associates. I will present but one side of the story, obviously, but it's the side I know best. I don't do that as a spokesperson. I'm not even Brazilian, or in the place of those who are on the ground in Brazil right now, living through the current conjuncture. I'm just going to try to offer a window into some conversations, arguments, and convictions of a few Afro-Brazilian-led social movements and civic organizations, in the hopes that this perspective also adds something to our collective understanding. Turn off the mic. Turn it up. How do I do that? Okay. You mean you didn't hear what I said? You didn't? All right. I'm going to take part of my time just to repeat. I'm presenting a point of view from my Afro-Brazilian movement colleagues, and I'm going to present things that just in the past week or so that I have heard or been given to understand from them, and that this is offering a window into a kind of a conversation. It is but one perspective, but I wanted to bring it tonight. I'm showing here results from Vox Populi, and this echoes what was already said. This is one of the main Brazilian public opinion organizations, and you can see it says, it asks people in a general manner, how do you evaluate the performance of the current president, Michel Temer? And as you can see, you don't even have to read Portuguese to know, positive, regular, more or less, negative 73%. Likewise, the question asked by Vox Populi, since Temer assumed the presidency in August 2016, has your life gotten better? Hasn't changed at all, or has gotten worse? And as you can see, 4% said their life has gotten better, 57% had said their life has worsened, 38% said nothing has changed. Also from Vox Populi, if there were a vote today, and they just ask people off the cuff, because they also do a structured set of questions where they set scenarios and people choose. But from the off the cuff, just straight up asking people, who would you vote for in the presidential elections if you voted now? And this is all over the country. So 39% said Lula. The next running is Jair Bolsonaro, who, if you know anything about Brazilian politics, then you know where he is. And then the next two are Brazilians of African descent, who have kind of arisen recently, at least Joaquim Barbosa as a possible candidate, and Marina Silva, both with just 2%. So if Lula ran today, if he could run today in the presidential elections, he would win. Of course, this, how did that happen? Okay. Of course, if you do this kind of poll across different parts, population sections or regions in Brazil, you get something slightly different. So here you see in the Northeast, the second column, Lula running at 64%. But you will notice that wherever it is in the whole country, Lula is running at the top. So it doesn't matter, Southeast and whatever, in less proportions or not. So for many black and working class Brazilians, their viewpoint is summed up in the words of one street vendor. He was the only one who did something for our class. One example of the black social movement's perspective on the current situation in Brazil is evident in the campaign, and there's been quite a lot of popular mobilization, not just around Lula's person, but around the loss, the threat to social rights. So this campaign, this current one, is called Rights Are Worth More, No to Social Cuts, and Yes to an Economy Favoring Life and Against All Types of Inequality. I received my copy. I don't have my colored copy, but I received my copy last week from Dr. Vilma Reis when we were at Harvard together, and she is the Ouvidora Pública, maybe we can call it a public ombudswoman for the state of Bahia. And the pamphlet and the campaign was launched in March at the World Social Forum's meeting in Salvador. That was unfortunate timing, I think, but it ended up being in Salvador. And the campaign is trying to stimulate public debate about the negative impacts of the austerity policy, which has now been instituted, on the daily lives of the population, and to get a particular constitutional amendment called Amendment Number 95 revoked. Amendment Number 95 places a ceiling on all public social expenditures for the next 20 years. Some of the negative effects that black social movements and others argue, and here I quote from Rights Are Worth More, the pamphlet, and I can add more if people are interested later. Well, it starts with two questions. So it says, you need to vote against. We need to agitate and mobilize to get this amendment revoked. And it asks two important questions. Is the economy getting better? And that's because the government says the economy is getting better. And so they ask, but for whom? And they also state the government's claim that there's only one way out of the current crisis. It's an economic crisis. That's what it is. And one way out. Reduce the salaries or the wages of the population and cut public spending. So they claim in this pamphlet, the political economy of austerity generates a vicious circle, and the people who are paying are the people who could least afford to pay. They ask a second question: who loses and who gains? The government is talking about a sacrifice, but who is making the sacrifice and who wins? And of course, the sacrifice is being made by the majority of the population. And I suppose I don't need to say here that by now, 54% of the population in Brazil self-identifies as Afro-descendant, and that Brazil is largely made up of working people. So of whom is this sacrifice being asked, and who wins? And they have, nice little pamphlets and videos. I started to show some of the videos, but it would take too much time, showing their point of view. But what I probably spend the rest of my time on is I decided I would do an interview. I would do it by WhatsApp. So that's what you're going to get. So I'm going to manipulate it a little bit. It won't be technically perfect, and the interview is conducted in Portuguese. I'll move between letting you hear a little bit of it so you know it's not my voice, it's his voice, and my translation. I thought it might be particularly useful in light of the recent brutal assassination of the Rio de Janeiro city councilwoman Marielle Franco and her driver, for me to interview another city council person, an elected city council member, this one from Salvador de Bahia, and who is, as Marielle was, a product of the black social movements and a still rare figure on the Brazilian national scene. In other words, an elected black public official. So I was trying to sound him out about what his thoughts were about some aspects of the current conjuncture, but as well also his thoughts about a possible different future for Brazil. One of the things that we talk about a lot is how the same narratives in Brazil have been circulating for 100 years. And if you count the narratives about slavery, you know, for 200 or 300 years, the same paradigm, the same discourse. So we often speculate, would it be possible to have another narrative about Brazil? So I'll play some excerpts and I'll translate as we go. We'll start at the bottom.
The bottom?
The first one. Yep.
Oh, that's the last one. You want that?
Oh, no, you're right. The first
This one
one.
right
Okay. No, the top. No, leave the
ask the
top one
questions?
out. No, I won't. So I'm asking the questions in Portuguese. I won't read much of that. I will go straight to what he says. So this is Councilman Silvio Humberto of the City of Salvador Public Council. Good afternoon, Councilman Silvio Humberto. Having been raised within the black movement and now serving as an elected politician, can you discern the possibility of a new narrative for Brazil in the 21st century? And if so, who's going to construct this narrative?
Boa tarde, professora Geri. Essa é uma pergunta extremamente, que eu diria, complexa, mas estratégica. Isso está diretamente relacionado à construção de um projeto político. E é evidente que, nesse cenário político, quando você não é parte, lembrando até Malcolm X, se você não é parte do problema, você é parte da solução. E nós estamos dentro de a crise que nós estamos vivenciando é uma crise também de disputa de narrativas, né? E eu entendo que esse país não alcançará sua plenitude se não fazer uso do que nós temos de melhor, que é a nossa diversidade étnico, racial e cultural. Então, nesse sentido, é fundamental a importância a narrativa do povo negro, a narrativa dos povos indígenas, dos quilombolas, que também são pessoas negras, quer dizer, a narrativa dos povos subalternizados. E para isso é de fundamental importância a nossa participação de forma ativa na política. Essa eleição não vai ser qualquer eleição, né? Essa eleição precisa ser uma eleição de reconquistas das nossas... de reconquista social. E para que o país tenha um avanço de fato civilizatório, eu digo, é estratégico, é essencial, é fundamental a nossa participação política. Então, isso significa discutir com afinco, com força, né, com determinação, o nosso projeto político.
Segunda pergunta, vereador. So I'm going to translate. The rest will be me saying what he said, but I wanted you to hear his voice so you know this is not me making it up. So, good afternoon, Professor Jury. At Brazil, you only have one name, right? Your first name. Your question is extremely complex, but also strategic. It is directly related to the construction of a political project. And obviously, in this political scenario, remembering what Malcolm X once said, if you're not part of the problem, you're part of the solution. We're living through a crisis, and that crisis is also a dispute over narratives. And in my understanding, this country will not reach its full potential unless we make use of the best thing we have, and that is our ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity. In that sense, the narrative of black people, of indigenous people, of quilombolas, who are also black people, I mean the narrative of those who have been made subaltern, is of fundamental importance. And for this, our active participation in politics is fundamentally important. This coming election will not just be any old election. This will be an election, or we need an election, to rescue what we had gained, our social gains. For the country to advance, to have a civilizing project, our political participation is essential, strategic, and fundamental. So that means we have to work hard, strong, and with determination to create and discuss a political project. And I know, and the second question I asked him, but you know people are really disillusioned, particularly in the black movement, with party politics. I know about our current disillusion, but it will be worse if we don't do anything. I mean this from A to Z, inside and outside the academy, on the streets, in the alleys, on the corners. We need to mobilize people, because we know that if with our participation they did what they did, imagine what will happen if we let ourselves become beat down by apathy and disillusion. Because the crisis that we have has its economic and financial dimensions, yes, which to a certain extent the country had been trying to work on. But the other part has been to try to take away any future prospects from the Brazilian people who are considered to be subaltern. In other words, to take away their hope. If you don't have hope, you don't dream. So we have to maintain alive our hope that it's possible to construct a more just Brazil, a Brazil with social justice. And then I ask, what would be the contours and the main obstacles of a new vision for Brazil? Prof, I would say that the main obstacle is racism and its manifestations, as well as when racism and sexism intersect. It's important to remember that we're living at the same time the old racism and the new racism. The old racism shows itself in the physical elimination of the black population, especially of our youth. We have in Brazil 60,000 killings per year, and of these, more than 70% are black people who live in the periphery and in the favelas. The same age group is, coincidentally, the same one which had begun to benefit from the affirmative action quotas entering into the universities. And today, this new racism is the fruit of a collective displacement, this stepping out of place, out of assigned place, due to affirmative action. It occurs the minute you step out of place and begin to enter collectively into spaces where before only one black individual or another entered. For example, in the academy and in spaces of consumption, public and commercial spaces. That's why we have a saying, racism doesn't go on vacation. And he goes on. I would say that another way out of the present conjuncture, or one of the ways out, is through the permanent development of cadres. And I don't know how to translate cadres. Cadres. It's a old left term. Cadres. How do you say it? Cadres. Quadros. But that's Portuguese. I'm trying to say it in English. Okay. Anyway, people who would make possible an intergenerational connection between old militants and contemporary younger activists, preparing people at all levels, and of course our diasporic connection. These are ideas that we need a longer conversation to parse out, but I would say that these elements are of fundamental importance in order to confront the current crisis, and for black Brazilians to try to construct a collective political project, preparing more young people, and also our links that we have with the diaspora. And Jerry, you've already answered my third question to a certain extent, but let me ask, this is the final question. What is the role of politics in taking power in the construction of a different Brazil? Silvio Humberto. Political participation is essential, understood in its widest sense. Participation and all of its dimensions, and also occupying a range of different spaces. We have to enter intentionally into those spaces. We also have to enter into the real world of party politics and into organizing collectives, bringing the youth in, stimulating people to participate in politics. In Brazil, politics has always been the preserve of the elites, the so-called political class. But people have found ways to follow politics nevertheless. Above all, we have to understand that when we're thinking about the future of the country, the construction of a sovereign country, that the socioeconomic construction of the Brazilian nation is not a technical question. It is a political question. I agree with intellectuals who think like this. Just as growing by concentrating income in a few hands was a political option, it's possible to choose another politics. That's why narrative is important. About whom are we speaking? To whom are we speaking? For whom are we speaking? I understand that we must continue to work with our grassroots organizations, but also to look at how the youth have been handling things, the question of aesthetics, their ways of organizing economically. Culture has an extremely important place in all this. We have to establish a path, some path, but it has to result from a dialogue with methods that have become classic from the years past, but also the challenges that have arisen in the 21st century. Forms of socioeconomic organization, hip-hop culture, funk, pagode, all the expressions which come from samba. We need that intergenerational connection, and we need external links too. Your country, he's talking to me, is extremely important in the global economy. In my understanding, it's possible to make other political choices, ones which might lead to another possible world.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Jim, for the invitation to be with you again and your students and colleagues. Well, there are two options about Brazil today. Either you despair or you laugh. And I tried a third path because I keep alternating between one and the other, which was to try to see things from a distance. I'm in a especially good position to do this because I'm not in the country and I do no social media at all. And so I just have news about the rage going on the internet, but I don't experience it. And this is maybe an advantage. But when I stop to think about what I see as that's going on in Brazil, many things, I came up with only two ideas that I thought I could say something about. And strikingly, I think there are two important things going on in Brazil today, two crises. One is epistemological, and the second one is conceptual, has to do with concepts, the way you use words. The epistemological one, I became aware of it when one of these receptions that we have at Harvard, probably have here too, at the beginning of the semester, you need to go one after the other. I met a judge. There were several young judges from Brazil who are doing some kind of training at Harvard, the same kind of training that I think Moro is so proud about, and also the PowerPoint genius. What's his name? Yeah. So these are two who came to Harvard to take this kind of classes. I was talking to him. The guy was really smart. The conversation was flowing well. And at some point, I asked him, but you know, I've read, as I actually had read, the 260 pages of Moro's sentence about Lula. And I haven't found any evidence of what was alleged against him. Neither is there any evidence that he got this apartment that people allege that belonged to him. Nor, and that's even worse, was there any evidence that whatever money was spent in the renovation of this apartment originated in kickbacks or in propinas associated with contracts made with the Brazilian government. There's nothing about these two things, objectively. And Moro recognizes it in the sentence. He argues, he shows, he is reaching his conclusion basically by inference. And so I asked him, how is it that judges can do that? Can judges, there's a question, we started talking about the question of the weight of indirect evidence in order to argue something. So that's why I think it's an epistemological question. I mean, what is it that makes you able to know what you claim to know? So then at some point, I was really struck by a sentence that he said to me. You know, after I was pressing him on the weight of indirect evidence in what Moro did, in an unfavorable way, he turned to me and said, "No, but you know, judges and historians do the same thing." Judges and historians do the same thing? Yes, I mean, we depend on indirect evidence to reach conclusions. That put me to think, because it's really a very, very, very important question in Brazil today. And the first thing I remembered, a book by Carlo Ginzburg, The Judge and the Historian. This is a book in which Ginzburg is convinced that the Italian judiciary system has reached an absurd, a wrong sentence against a friend of his that was accused of a terrorist act that he never admitted into doing, and Ginzburg was convinced that his friend was telling the truth. And he read all the materials for the trial, and he showed that the judges made a leap that it should never be authorized to make, which was from contextualization, from indirect evidence, from knowledge about a certain system and actions that are going on regularly. They concluded that this individual, located where he was at a certain point in time, must have done what they thought people were regularly doing in that context. Do you understand what I mean? It was kind of from context to conclusions about individual behavior and about individual acts. And I also thought about my long experience reading criminal trial records and what we learned from them. If you read a criminal trial record as a social historian, as I do, one thing I never worry about is to know what actually happened in terms of individual acts. Did João kill Maria or not? Well, sometimes you know for sure because of there's no contrasting, there is no contradictory evidence, and you can know, there's no reason for you to doubt that some basic facts are part of the picture. Other times you don't know because, you know, the evidence is contradictory and so on. But first of all, and mainly, I don't care. Right? I mean, what really matters is to see what is offered in these circumstances during a trial as plausible versions about what happened. It's the plausibility, the verisimilitude, the possibility of being taken as truth is what makes a statement valuable for a historian. Because it's the collection of many possible versions which will allow me to reach conclusions about cultural aspects, about experiences, about conflicts, and so on. So I'm not ever worried about knowing for sure what individuals did in given situations, but I'm very much paying attention to the several versions that are made available to them, because that shows possibilities and limits in given situations. So the weight of indirect evidence to me is obviously enormous, right? But I never use indirect evidence to reach conclusions about individual acts and behavior. Never. What I do has nothing to do with what judges have to do. There's nothing in common. Our epistemologies should be completely different. Until the car wash operation came. And then things started to happen. There's a very interesting article by the PowerPoint genius in which he tries to explain the epistemology of judging corruption cases. And it's a kind of an apology for indirect evidence. And he starts with a very telling example, which is the cat and vase example. There is a vase in the middle of a room and a cat. The cat is on one corner and the vase is in the middle. And then you lock the door and you leave for 10 minutes. You go back and the vase dropped. You can conclude that the cat did the job of dropping the vase. From that, he writes like 20 pages of the reason why indirect evidence is absolutely essential for what judges do. It's interesting because if you read historians in the future, we will have a lot to learn from Moro's sentence. I don't think they will know whether Lula did or not what the judge concluded he did. Maybe we'll never know. But there are several things that are interesting that we can learn. For example, there is a passage in which it's items 502, 503 of the sentence, page 111, more or less. This is the zelador, which is the, what's that? The person responsible for the maintenance of the building, custodian, okay? He's being interrogated at this point by the defense lawyer, and Moro uses the transcription of the question and answer, in this case, as one more evidence that Lula owned the apartment. And the conversation is the following. I won't read in Portuguese. I'd separate it to read in Portuguese, but I think it will take too long. The situation is the following. The lawyer asks, did people who lived in the building know that Lula had an apartment in that building? And the custodian says, yes, everybody knew that Lula had an apartment there. And the people who sold the units, the employees of OAS, who sold units in the building when they had the sale days there, they would tell everybody who was interested in buying an apartment there that, you know, oh, you'll be Lula's neighbor. How nice. It's so good that you're going to be living here and you'll be Lula's neighbor and so on. Use this as a piece of propaganda, as advertisement to sell the apartments. And this is one of the many pieces that Moro uses to show that it was publicly known that the apartment belonged to Lula. I thought, wow. In terms of proving that Lula owned the apartment, of course, this is rubbish, right? But in terms of from a historian outlook, this is a lot of interesting information, right? I mean, you see how the accumulation of symbolic capital, which Lula represented at this point, we were in 2010. Lula had left the presidency with 80% approval rate. So if you had anything associated with his name, was a big asset for you. And so they were using that information, that capital, symbolic capital accumulation, to actually accumulate real capital, selling the units. Right? There is another interesting point, which doesn't come from the sentence, comes from an interview that one of these very smart journalists wanted to get Lula to say things that would compromise him. And he asked Lula, but Lula, it is known that you went to the apartment there, to that building, once. But why is it that when you went there, Leo Pinheiro, the owner of the construction company, went there with you? Why is it? Why was it so important? Does that implying that means that Lula was really the owner of the apartment? And Lula looked at him and said, well, what do you mean? I'm more important than Leo Pinheiro. I mean, it was his interest. He was accumulating symbolic capital. I don't care about Leo Pinheiro. Who is Leo Pinheiro? I'm Lula, right? And so, but it's another example of the accumulation of symbolic capital. Leo Pinheiro made a lot of money, seeming to be very close to Lula. And he was taking, and not only him, but many people who gravitate around the events mentioned in the sentence are people who are obviously benefiting for this seeming association with Lula. So the Moro sentence is very rich, will be very important for future historians to understand how politics was done in this relation between these entrepreneurs and politics and how that worked in the Brazilian political and business scene. But you know, again, it's very hard to from these types of evidence to jump into conclusions about what Lula did or did not do. So there's a real interesting epistemological problem here, and perhaps Jim can organize a conference to promote a frank scholarly discussion on the epistemologies of history and law. I mean, on what basis can we know what we claim to know in history and in law? What are the circumstances that allow us to leap from the general to the particular? Because this is what's going on here. You leap from the general to the particular. You leap from knowledge of a system that's going on to conclusion about the doings of specific individuals. So from knowledge about contexts and large cultural conditioning, how do you jump to knowledge about individual acts and motivations? So this is my first question. Brazil is going through an epistemological crisis, of all crises that we're going through. We have also that one. My second point is about the ideological work of imprecise or broad definitions of concepts that are used to impact and or pass judgment on other people's behavior or motivation. That's really interesting because all of a sudden, decades of training as a social historian became useful to understand what politicians are going through. Right? Because, for example, if you study the social history of Brazil in the 19th century, there is a concept that was very much spoken about at that time of European origin, French and British, but used in Brazil, which was the idea of dangerous classes, which was very much talked about in the Brazilian parliament on the years after the end of abolition. Who were the dangerous classes? They were the poor. They were the people who had left slavery and who were free people of color, who were going through a major economic and social transformation without having any political rights, without having the right to vote even, which was prohibited for illiterate people. And they were seen as a whole, poor people were seen as the dangerous classes. They were accused of vagrancy, they were the ones suspected by the police, they lived in the slums, the cortiços, and so on and so forth. Now, within the concept of dangerous classes, when that concept traveled from European contexts to Brazil, it became very much racialized. So the dangerous classes in Brazil are not only the poor, but even more suspect than the general's dangerous classes. The more dangerous among the dangerous ones were black people, deemed to be more dangerous than the others. So within the larger concept, there is also a focus that gives a local contextualized meaning to a concept that originated elsewhere. Now, it's incredible this all of a sudden becomes useful to try to understand what's happening in Brazil today. At some point, when the political climate quiets down, I think we must have a very serious conversation about the very loose definition of corruption, the very uncertain boundaries between corruption and what else is outside of it, today is hard to see, that allow its application solely according to one's assumptions about and ideological tendencies. What I mean to say is, corruption is so widespread, political activity is so criminalized as a whole at this point, that it allows a lot of interpretation by the people who are using the concept to prosecute and to incarcerate others. Making the analogy of the dangerous classes, for the Brazilian traditional elites, the Workers' Party is not white, never was. Lula is not white. Lula is a Northeasterner, and Northeasterners are not white in the toxic, white supremacist environment that exists in the state of São Paulo. São Paulo, which is perhaps the main engine of the Brazilian economy? Perhaps it is, but it is for sure the main driving force of the coup d'etat of 2016, and it's the main driving force of the ongoing coup. I mean, in the past, people thought of political movements that never ended, associating them with Trotskyists, the revolution, permanent revolution. In Brazil now we have the permanent right-wing coup d'etat. It's still going on. You know, when it's going to end, nobody knows. So what I'm trying to say is that the imprecise use, the imprecise boundaries of what these judges understand corruption to mean, it becomes such an encompassing type of concept that it allows them a lot of latitude, a wide scope, at their discretion. They can apply it in a very selective manner, as they have been doing since the car wash operation started. So here, if I were a high-tech kind of presenter, there would be a PowerPoint, an image. And the image, which all of you can picture, because all of you have seen it, is the picture of the car wash team, remember? It's about a dozen individuals, all of them white, all of them male, well, and so on. I mean, I don't need even need to, I can deduce the rest. I mean, middle class or high middle class people, because these are the only ones who can succeed in these concursos públicos in order to become judges. So they all must have gone to good private schools. They have never had a child of African descent ever in their classrooms. They grew up as kids in one of the most segregated societies worldwide, racially, socially, economically. And these are the people who are passing judgment on everybody with this type of latitude in regard to concepts and in regard to epistemology. I don't think they are qualified either epistemologically or in terms of concepts that they are using to be doing history. At least if they think what they are doing is similar to what historians do, I'm sorry, no, you have to study a lot more. A PhD takes about 10 years to get. So come back to school and try to understand what kind of epistemology you are deploying to reach the conclusions you are concluding. We need to have a conversation about the epistemology of law in history and see these guys telling us that what they are doing is the same historians do. Because this leads us to a lot of confusion and the mystery that we always come to in the end of this type of conversation is why is there so much resistance to change in Brazilian society? Why is it that the persistence of inequality has been the most salient characteristic of our history? And why we can't change that? And that complete, the conversation that we had before. All of us talked about that. Anyways, thank you.
We have ample time for questions, and Sydney, following the tradition of maybe taking 3 or so questions and then letting the panel answer.
So I take 3 or 4 each time? Okay, good. All right. So it's open for comments and questions. Say your name first, and then yes, please. Yeah, you.
My name is David Wilson, Brown, class 60. So what is the state of democracy in Brazil? What is the outlook? Where is it going? I understand there's quite a conservative element growing. So where are we headed?
Next.
Well, that may be what the panel can just answer.
I wanted to know more about the city councilor.
What's her name, please?
Ramona.
Ramona? Okay.
So I wanted to know more about the city councilor who was killed, some of the specific things that she was involved with that led to her assassination. And who do you think assassinated her?
Is that a third question? I mean, we have two questions here that we can spend the rest of the hour talking about. Yes, Jim?
Who's going to be the next president of Brazil?
That is the easiest one. Okay, so we can start. Oh, but we collected 3 already. Can we have a first round and then? So go ahead.
Quer começar aqui na ordem?
I guess so, yeah. I think,
Precisa
Hi.
responder tudo também.
yeah, I think I'll try to, oops. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. I think I'll try to start answering your question, because that's the question I guess most people have. Who is going to be the next president of Brazil? Because everything is so unpredictable right now. We don't even know who is running for election. So it's a little bit hard to say that right now. So, I mean, I also agree that if Lula is going to run in this election, he has really, really high chances of winning. But I doubt that this is going to happen, and I guess the Workers' Party also know that. Even though he's actually able to run as for now, right? Because according to Brazilian law, you're only unable to run for election if you're judged, like, after your last appeal.
Right.
Okay, but he's going to be condemned. And
I
he's,
think is after the second appeal, I think.
yeah. Okay, but let's assume.
Current law.
Yeah. So let's assume that Lula is not running. And if he indicates someone to run instead of him, either Haddad, Ciro, I think that if the left is not united, there are like really high chances that Bolsonaro might be one of the candidates who win. I really hope not, but I think that's a threat that like the left has to look at and really, really consider. And I don't know, I also think that one of the things that, I don't know, Sérgio Moro or the Supreme Court or the media in general doesn't understand about the Brazilian voter is that we're all very pragmatic people. So I guess they're trying to say that corruption should be like a priority among us, like the fight against corruption. But that's not possible. I think as long as we are still, as long as people we still don't have like food to eat, or they don't have housing, or they don't have a job, corruption will always be a secondary problem. So whoever comes up with a solution to the problems we have in Brazil, not necessarily like problems related to corruption, but I mean like these fundamental problems, is gonna win. It doesn't really matter if it's Bolsonaro or Haddad. Whoever comes with a solution is gonna win. Because I think we're not very ideological people in the end. We just want a solution for a problem. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Can I disagree just a little with you?
Sure.
What gives me some, I have to disagree because I want to have some hope. and there is one thing which has been consistent in elections in Brazil since Fernando Henrique was elected, which is in 6 elections, my impression is that the electorate chose the candidate they identified as center-left. Fernando Henrique, I mean, the PSDB was not what it has become when Fernando Henrique was elected, right? Neither Lula was in 1998 what he became in 2002 to get elected. So there is a certain, I think the presidential election in Brazil is the only election, major election, that is more politicized, that people have enough time to understand the different proposals and choose a president that seems to address the questions you were talking about. And they have been consistent in choosing people they identify, candidates they identify as center-left candidates. And just between us, electors in Brazil have been very smart. Unless Bolsonaro destroys everything, I don't think Trump would have had a chance in Brazil. I mean, consider the consistency of the last 6 elections. It's not just 2 or 3. I mean, it's 6 elections. Fernando Henrique twice, Lula twice, Dilma twice. It's all center left. The thing is whether we are going to have a candidate that will be identified, or which candidate is going to be identified with this guy. Collor, I don't think is the case. I don't think Collor was the case, no. Collor was not identified as center left.
I want to address David's question about, so what is the state of democracy? David, right? So one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind is that the very question about that you posed is up for debate right now in Brazil. And it's important. And one of the things that we can't stress enough is the extent to which there is a polarization in Brazilian society. I mean, I think in a rough sort of analog to the United States context about what's going on with Trump and Comey, it's the way some people see that as totally a political witch hunt, and others see it as something that's, you know, legitimate and justified. Something similar, although not exactly the same, is going on, I think, in Brazil, where some people will look at what's going on and everything we've talked about and say, no, the institutions are working. I mean, just look, a former president is behind bars. That never would have happened. The institutions are working. Other people will look at it and say, it's not enough to have institutions, you know, working, doing the day-to-day work of adjudicating evidence and all these things, if the substance upon which they're deciding is bogus or is, you know, cooked up, is trumped up. So the state of Brazilian democracy, I think, is incredibly divided, is incredibly, you know, sort of ill-defined about what direction to take. And until we find a way of resolving this central tension, is Brazil living in a sort of state of exception right now, since the impeachment against Dilma, which goes back to another, it sort of moves this polarization back a little bit further and gets to something that Sydney talked about, but this question of sort of definitional clarity. What happened in that moment? Was that an impeachment, a legitimate impeachment in which the institutions functioned, or was it something sort of that crossed the line of political propriety? So there is this confusion, there's polarization about what every sort of political development signifies. That is not a satisfying answer in any way, but I think it helps us to understand the state of the Brazilian democracy, which is just sort of, who knows what's going to happen? Who knows where it's going to go?
I will answer Ramona's question only in part, because there's a lot more that could be said to give a biography of Marielle. But I will use that just to try to tease out a different way possibly of thinking about politics in Brazil. I had, it's not really social media, but they do write me WhatsApp. Every morning I have 10 WhatsApps from, you know, somebody in Brazil. And one of the ones that came to me this afternoon when I said what the purpose of this meeting with this panel would be, he said, you know, in Brazil, for a lot of people, the definition of politics is just the presidential elections. And do you vote? Some of us are beginning to consider that perhaps the definition of politics in Brazil is not just the presidential election and if you get to vote. In that context, someone like Marielle Franco, who lost her life, becomes an important new ontological type. Since we're talking about epistemology, we might as well talk about ontology too. A new being, a new type, a black elected official. There have been some, you know, since Abdias Nascimento and others, you know, but it still has always been quite rare. Marielle is part of a newer set of people, younger. She was Afro-Brazilian descent. Even that is a creation of a new ontological type, because if you looked at her and classified her 30 years ago, you would say parda, mixed. She herself identified herself, which is, you know, is a more recent development of the last decade or so, maybe 2 decades, fruit of black social movements. She identified as Afro-Brazilian. She's also a woman, and a young woman in a very sexist society, and she was a lesbian, publicly and out with a partner in a, you know, a stable home that they had constructed a family. She came from the favela. You know what a Okay, what favela is. So she is. I had one of the clips that I had. I don't know if it has English translation or not, but it's Spanish translation. Okay, sorry. But her in her own voice. It's called Mariela in her own voice, and she says, "Negra." And she looks like she could have been the production of Him and Me. So negra, self-definition, negra, lesbica, favelada. And you politicians are going to have to get, she's speaking in the in the municipal chamber, so the city council of Rio de Janeiro. You're going to have to get used to more people like me entering into politics. I'm paraphrasing, but I think I'm pretty true to it. Entering into politics and speaking out. So what were the issues? Of course, she talked about poverty and economic inequality. She also talked about homophobia. She particularly talked about the violence against transgender people, gays, the LGBT community. She talked about school and education. In other words, the social conditions and social rights that the marginalized people, the people with less power in Brazil, which is the majority of Brazilians. So she was representing a type of politics that was very courageous, very, we like to say in the United States, I hate the term, but oppositional. And she represents something. The reason why I interviewed Silvio Humberto is he comes from the same space. These are people who grew up in favela or periphery neighborhoods or traditional black neighborhoods in the major cities, who by hook, crook, eating out. There's a saying in Jamaica about poor black women who send their children to school through deep hardship. And the song says, "Mama spent her last to send you to class. Your mother spends her last penny to send you to class." Some of them now beginning to study because of affirmative action, the hated affirmative, the dread curse of the white middle class in Brazil. And I quote a set of ladies that I was at a hotel in a lunch a couple of years back, and they said, the discussion was how hard it was to get a maid now. And it was really hard to get a maid because Lula sent these girls to school. Affirmative action in the universities. And the first statistics are coming in now. The kids did very well. Yes, they got in by affirmative action, but they did very well. Outstanding students, good graduation rate. And so that generation is there. And if they do away with affirmative action, maybe. But there are enough of them and enough of an impulse, I think, that people who are not from the middle class, who are not from the elites, indigenous people, poor people, people from the sertão and whatever, could possibly go to school. And if they do, then they have a different consciousness of who they are and what spaces they might enter in. So killing Mariela was an attempt to kill that. But the people that I talked to, including the one whose interview I played, he's also black, also city councilman, has a PhD in economics, teaches as a professor, straight from the black movement. It took 5 years of his family and his friends to persuade him to even run from office. Because a lot of people in the black movement, including the ones who were with PT, the Workers' Party, they parted with people in the Workers' Party because they would never face up to the need for Brazil to have a conversation and move on the question of race. So a lot of the people that you see in the black movement who have broken with the PT were raised in the hands of the PT. So what Mariela represented was this fairly new set of politicians. And I would say if you really like politics, you should also follow not just the presidential election, which is extremely important, but look at the who's getting elected to municipal offices, who's going to run for state offices, who's going to run for the national, what do they call it, Câmara?
National Chamber of Deputies. The
Chamber of Deputies, etc. That's a longer outlook. It's not going to happen this fall, but I think politically it's very important. And this question of reconceptualizing, thinking of new terms, thinking of different meanings for old terms, which is, the question that you raised, which I think is extremely important. You got to keep your eye on somebody other than just the usual cast of characters, be they in jail or out of jail, because something might happen, and it's only might. For the gentleman who asked the state of democracy, I think that the reply was exactly right. Kind of up in the air. You need to watch it.
And also, if I may, just very quickly on Mariela's death, I think to fit it into the paradigm I was describing of this extreme polarization, immediately after her death, figures within Temer's government tried to say, see, this is an outcome of the violence in Rio, which justifies the federal government's intervention in the state of Rio. In other words, to try to depict it as a terrible event, but part of some of the normal sort of violence. Whereas I think most people saw it as something different, something exceptional, and targeting this woman for all that she represented was something exceptional. It wasn't just normal violence that Brazil experiences. It was an attempt to send a message. So again, this polarized way of interpreting every political event. Thank you.
More questions? Who is?
The guy back there.
In the green shirt.
Yeah, go ahead. You have your microphone already.
My name is Jia Hong. So my question is, if you could talk about how neighboring countries are responding to the crisis that's going on in Brazil, and especially with regard to democracy and international relations.
Better? No? Good? Okay. Okay.
My name is Tammy, and I really appreciated, Andre, your presentation and the kind of parallels you drew between Vargas and Lula, and I myself see a lot of parallels between that sort of time period and what we're seeing now, and I worried that maybe this is not rock bottom for Brazilian politics and that there's still more to come. But I want to pick on Sydney's hope, and if there is sort of hope for Brazilian politics in the future, and Professor Augusto, you've highlighted that the Black social movements in Brazil have laid a very strong foundation, and we're seeing some of the fruits of that labor, and we're seeing some of the opportunities, while still limited, afforded to those who have been marginalized, kind of bearing fruit. If the hope can possibly be placed on that, who should we be looking for and like looking out for and following that could provide that hope? And you had sort of pointed out that the other two people on that list were Afro-Brazilian politicians. Is one of them okay? But if there is sort of hope within in that, like who should we be looking at and following to have a better understanding of what's to come?
I thank you so much for your presentations. It was very stimulating. But I want to first ask to put something else in the questions that are already there. First, what is the main democracy pillars? That's my question, right? And I understand your question, but understand your answer, but what would be, for me, and I just named some, it's liberty of opinion, liberty of mobilization and manifestation and organization, the set, and the possibility of having a debate based on some kind of epistemology on facts, right? This is some of it. And then the institutions, okay? And of course, the tradition of resistance in Brazil against dictatorship put democracy, including social and economic justice in there, right? Because we fought for a human rights-based constitution, which is an integral human rights perspective. And so I think we need to think about what democracy are we talking about, and I would love to listen from you there. The second question, and I think I want to hear from you the piece of the media thing, you know, because being in the United States for 9 months now, I'm totally shocked when I go back to Brazil and look at the media in Brazil. There is no contradictory, how do you say that? There is no different position. The Lula judgment, the Lula imprisonment was followed by 60 hours on TV without any person of the left. People, there is one generation of people in Brazil, my students at the university, don't remember a time when there is a panel of different positions, when there is a leftist person in the panel discussing any kind of political issue in Brazil, like a big strike, like the imprisonment of the president. There is never contradictory visions in the media. And I think this is a key issue. And second, social movements are being beaten more than my generation who fought against dictatorship was. I mean, there is more people aleijado, how do you say that? Crippled by the police violence on the movements, like old ladies, younger kids, small kids, all kinds of people in the resistance in the last 2 years than my generation was. And I lived the resistance in the 70s. I'm not talking about the political prisoners. I'm talking about social movements on streets that are not disseminated by the media. Again, nobody knows it. You know, we know it because we sign Jornalistas Livres and other, and Media Ninja and other kinds of information. So my question, and I will use one thing that I saw you talking in that wonderful meeting, that I don't think we have polarization. My husband is the political science and the farmer. I'm not, but I'm just like to think politics. But I mean, I don't think it's a polarization. I think we live the experience of explosion, of being after, you use that term, when you talk about the impression that black people, black women felt. That's what I hear from you. After Mariela's last week. Okay. You use this notion of after we feel like we are after an explosion, because what I see is that any small authority do whatever they want. I mean, Moro is not obeying the Supreme Court right now, right? He's doing what he wants, right? The police in Rio said that the 150 people who were arrested in the in so-called militia thing, it was not a militia thing, should prove their innocence, and things like that. I mean, the policeman decides what to do individually. You know, I feel like we are in an explosion, a dispersion. We are not divided in two. You know, we are feeling like survivors of an explosion, as she said, the black movement. I think it was a wonderful metaphor, right? After the black movement, or women like me in the left, that's how I see Mariela, women like me fighting for memory and truth movement, as I met Mariela doing it in Maré, right? Feel right now like a survivor of explosion. I'd like to hear more about the notion of democracy and this notion of not two sides, but the dispersion of power, of individual power to do whatever the interpretation with no basic shared epistemology. Epistemology.
We answer this round, and I think we're going to call it to go to the reception. Do you want to just go down like this?
Okay, I can go quickly. Well, in terms of what is democracy, I think we were pretty sure until very recently, right, in Brazil. I mean, there are two things, I think, there are components to a Brazilian concept of democracy that appeared during the democratization period. One, we more or less took for granted, and that was the great mistake, which was elections, respecting the result of elections, and due process in major elections, which we thought was going smoothly, right? After, even the impeachment of Collor seemed to strengthen democracy because it was consensual, right? And then we had 6 elections with wonderful presidents being elected. Even though we might have differences here and there, but these were very decent people elected, Fernando Henrique, Lula, and Dilma. So we were more or less taking representative democracy for granted. It was going well. This was the fatal error. But I think we're working with a definition of democracy which had a lot to do with social rights. And this is where conflicts and the social dynamic was going on, right? I mean, the Constitution of 1988 included a number of rights that still had to become reality. But that also allowed social movements of different kinds to have an agenda, and this was what democracy was about, to struggle to make these social rights come into existence and not exist only on paper. And this is where we were until 2015, when the responsibility of some political forces brought the situation we are in now. So I think we knew. Now I don't know. Now I think it's because everything is in the air, and I don't know how, we don't know how that's going to evolve. However, because for 2 decades or more, we had this social agenda that social movements struggled for under the recognition of the Constitution itself. They took root. They took root. I mean, if you want to, well, this is Brazil. There is no initiative by the Minister of Education or the Brazilian government to undo the law that established affirmative action policies for access to the universities, right? So there are 2 options there. One is a positive interpretation. They won't do it because the social movements are strong and the universities are going to resist, and they know they cannot pick up that fight and have a chance to win. Positive interpretation. Negative one, we can have a textbook example of Brazilian racism. Once you open the door of the universities to black people, you are going to cut funding and strangle them so that this advantage will mean nothing to them. But this would be textbook Brazilian racism. You don't use a racialized language, but you guarantee the continuation of racial exclusion without even seeming to be bothering about racism. I'll leave the other ones for you.
So I'll begin with the question about sort of how maybe Brazil's neighbors or maybe even the hemisphere are looking at what's going on. I think one thing that's clear, I mean, objectively, what everyone thinks of the government is that it's sought to reduce Brazil's footprint in the hemisphere and the world. In other words, whereas Lula and Dilma, to a certain extent, were very aggressive in pursuing an international role for the for Brazil in Latin America, but also with the famous BRICS. That's very quickly been, the brakes have been pressed on that agenda. So that's on Brazil's side. I think there's been a clear effort to sort of disengage and to look inward. But lost my train of thought. So, and also in terms of the sort of the conjuncture in Latin America, I think clearly there is a change in the direction of the political winds in Latin America. Whereas Lula came into power and there was what was often called the pink tide, so friendly governments throughout the region, that's totally changed. So I don't think places like Argentina, for example, where Mauricio Macri, who was a center-right candidate, and in the election that Chile just had, where there's overall conservative forces that are coming into power, I don't think that there's, at least from what I've seen, and maybe you all can say something different, but that there's that much of, not to say that there is an interest in what's going on in Brazil, because absolutely there is, but I think a lot of Brazil's neighbors are looking at Brazil also sort of aghast and saying, sort of what Sydney was saying, Brazil was sort of doing so well, there was this stability, and all of a sudden, boom, sort of chaos. And so I think that Brazil's neighbors are looking perplexed at what's happening. Just some brief comments on Vera's question. I think very generally, and this is a simplified reading, but it's, I think, helpful. There are camps. We can think of camps in Brazilian society and the Brazilian political landscape. One generally committed to what we might call a progressive agenda of sort of social inclusion, an agenda that includes the cotas that we talked about and things like Bolsa Familia, these sort of small steps, but really I think significant ones to address this long history of racial exclusion, social exclusion. So that's one camp. Another camp is one that encompasses what we might call the center right and the far right, which is not only rejects these, but wants to undo whatever sort of progressive advances were secured in the past, decade or so. And then there's this sort of broad, amorphous center that is, I think, if not up for grabs, but it's doesn't usually it's hard to predict, right? And so we saw the numbers that Professor Augusto showed about Lula's favorability ratings. That I think is significant, but do I think that that means that most Brazilians would consider themselves leftists? Probably not. But I think it suggests something appealing about the vision that says, no, Brazil will never be a full democracy until these questions are addressed. It will never be a full democracy until people like Marielle Franco are playing significant roles and are not the exception in Brazilian government. And I think that this is why when I say polarization, I think if we distill everything down, there are these differences we can point to about national agenda, where the nation should go. Mm-hmm. And the task of politics is to sort of harness that and say, this is the direction we're going to take. Mm-hmm. And as Sydney said, it looked like Brazil was going in one direction. But now we're seeing very serious signs that it might go in a very different direction. Hence the confusion. Which isn't satisfying, but.
On the neighboring countries, one might want to point out, I think the neighboring countries question man is gone, but it's you, okay. Among the neighboring countries is Venezuela, which is in deep trouble. So I'll just say, that Venezuelans are, I won't say pouring, but crossing the border to get into Brazil. And there's some very interesting things about that, who Brazil welcomes. Haitians are also coming. Who Brazil welcomes and who Brazil does not welcome, and who actually sees Brazil with all its crises and problems as a possible escape route. So among the people tend to think Brazil's neighbors go to the south, but Venezuela is a neighbor of Brazil, and it's in trouble itself. And I think that's an interesting thing to watch. Your questions were very complex and very good. I would like to get a room full of Brazilian politicians, and there are ones other than the ones who appear in the Vox Populi, to discuss that. I think one of the most interesting things for me is the level of debate and discussion that actually does go on in Brazil. However, as you know better than I do, Brazil's mass media are controlled by 5 families, or however many it is, TV Globo and the whole oligopoly complex. So what you're listening to and reading is coming as, conventional mass media, it might look like nobody's talking about anything, nothing's going on, just the usual. And I think this is where technology is beginning to play a very important role. The people who have a different position or a different thing to say or a different analysis, they don't expect to get on TV Globo, maybe on one of those Saturday morning odd kind of programs. They go on the internet. And I feel like you do, Sydney. I turn my stuff off. I tell people don't text, don't tweet, don't whatever. But the reality is an awful lot of public dialogue in Brazil is going on the internet. So and then also, how segmented.
The alternative press.
Okay, good.
I'm not on Facebook. Stuff.
Great. Okay, great. I'm with you, except that the reality is this is where all the the debate, the discussion is taking place. Every movement worth its name has its own, blog, page, whatever. People are mobilized via these things. The other thing is that besides the online mobilization, people are in the streets in Brazil, including those who get beat up and whipped in huge, massive demonstrations. They don't all take place in Sao Paulo. They might take place in Belo Horizonte, or they might, and the black and women's movements are way out front in this. Every 6 months, there's a massive demonstration, of which, some people might get beat, some people might get gassed, but they're out there over and over again. And they have odd names like A Marcha do Cabelo Crespo, the nappy-haired People's March. So nappy hair is one dimension, their Afro identity, but they're also looking at questions of the environment, questions of gender and social justice. So, and it's just fascinating to me how many people are out there. Or you can talk about samba and how samba is used as a means of floating political messages. The samba that won the prize in Rio de Janeiro, I think this year, it was either the prize one or the second one, was this sharp critique of sharp, and millions of people watched that on TV. Now, not all of them watching it outside Brazil would exactly know what the letter was, but you could see the float. So, if you think about your questions are posed, they're very important, but you're posing them kind of in a conventional way. And yeah, in the conventional way, things look completely closed up, completely on lockdown, and only one version of a narrative. But I think that this narrative is being created, or these positions are being debated in spaces that are not quite the ones from when you and I were young militants. This is a kind of a different space. And I think that the courage of people who do this is just, is just amazing. The things that people in the many of the black social movements and, and poor people's social movements are concerned about is not just, I'll repeat, Lula getting elected or Bolsonaro getting elected. They're really, really concerned about the social gains, these social gains of the last decade being rolled back. So when they're mobilizing, they're not just mobilizing, well, don't put Lula in jail or get Lula out. They're mobilizing because Bolsa de Familia, or what is the one about housing, Teto de I don't know what. And they're doing analysis about how taking away those basic rights or those basic social gains is putting people in a position to not participate politically fully. Because if you're worried about hunger again for the first time in, a decade, or if you're worried about housing, that puts you, in a different space. And these are the things that they're really concerned about. And the second thing they're concerned about is genocide against black youth and against the indigenous population. There were some figures about how many leaders of indigenous people's movements were killed so far, and we were in the month of March when the statistic was quoted. Those are their concerns as well. I don't say that people are not concerned about the politics at the top level, but those are their concerns. And when they're mobilizing and when they're talking, it's this kind of stuff, that I was saying. And I want to commend to you a report. And there are also strange but interesting coalitions coming up, like the Coalition for Democracy. And it really is a coalition, nascent problems and whatever, but these coalitions are also springing up. I don't say, okay, I have great hope in them, but I say we should watch them. We should put our eye on something other than the usual. And finally, the first director of Amnesty International in Brazil is for the first time. I don't know if she's the first woman head. I think she probably is, but she's definitely the first black person. So she's a black woman, lesbian, who is the head. And the Amnesty International report, State of the World's Human Rights, has its Brazil section, which she would have been largely responsible for pulling together. And it's a very interesting one if you want to also ask questions about what's the current state, because they go through, legal, constitutional, and institutional developments, the basic rights. They go through a set of things. And yeah, Brazil comes out real bad, real bad in the report. But the report is done. The report is being discussed. The report is circulating. So maybe my sum up remark is maybe we should keep our eye on different levels and different actors as well.
So I will give the word to Inan to close.
Yeah. I
yes.
actually
and
have...
You have the last word.
Nice, thank you. I think I actually just have a very small comment on the question about what is the state of democracy in Brazil, because I guess I started my presentation by saying that Brazilian democracy is under attack right now, especially because of Lula's imprisonment. But I guess it's also important to point out that it's not just like with Lula's imprisonment that democracy is under attack. If we think before that, we already had a judicial system that was very classist and it was very racist. And an example of that is just the case of Rafael Braga. I guess you're all very familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And we also have a police which is very classist, which is very racist, and I guess those are not characteristics of functioning and healthy democracy anywhere, including Brazil. And I guess that's just a thing that is important for people to bear in mind when we talk about democracy in Brazil. And, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I want to thank our panelists. I truly want to say that the partnership with Harvard, with Sydney and other allies there is very important for Brown University. We're very excited because new energy is coming to Brown. We're going to be receiving Leila Lenin as the new chair of the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies from the University of New Mexico in the fall. Her partner, Jeremy Lenin, will also be here as well. There's a kind of new energy coming into Brown for Brazilian studies. Mm-hmm. I think this panel represented many things to me. New blood, graduate students, colleagues who are really important and represent the longitude of the struggle, and allies in other universities. So thank you all, and thank you all. We're now having a reception. We hope you all join us there.